Okay, today is Yud Aleph, Eruvin Daf Yud Aleph. We're going to start on Yud Amud Bet at the very bottom, the last four lines of the of Yud Amud Bet, where it says Im yesh lo tzurat hapetach afal pi sherachav me'eser eno tzarich lema'et. So it said in the Mishnah that we know that a mavoi that we want to permit carrying in this mavoi satum, which is closed on three sides, it's open on the fourth side. We want to permit it either with lechi or korah, either with a cross beam going across the top or with a beam on the side. And so, if it's, as we had said, that if it's 20 amot tall, more than 20 amot tall rather, or it's wider than 10 amot, it's no good. But if you put a tzurat petach, which means to say, if you not only put a stick on the side, but you actually make the shape of a doorway. So the shape of a doorway is defined as two vertical poles and a cross beam. Okay, like the elevator behind you would be a good example of what a tzurat petach would look like. So if you have that, even if it's wider than 10 amot, it is acceptable for carrying and can be used. So the Gemara is going to ask, now that means that we've learned in the Mishnah that if it is too wide, you can fix it by putting tzurat petach, right? You can put the form of a doorway, and the extra width is no longer a problem. You neutralize the problem. Similarly, we said earlier that if it's too tall, a maltera can work. What's a maltera? That means that if you have a korah on top, if you have the cross beam on top, and it's decorated with some kind of fancy designs, whatever it is, it looked like birds' nests or whatever they said before. So you have some kind of a fancily designed korah going over the top. So then, even though it's higher than 20 amot, everyone is going to look at it because of the artwork. So you're not going to have to worry that it's too tall. So we know that we have a solution for the width. The solution for the width is you can put the tzurat petach. The solution for it being too high is you can put a cross beam that is very fancy and artistic, so everybody will look at it. But we turn to Yud Aleph Amud Aleph Ibchamai. What if we did the opposite? In other words, what if we said it's too tall, let's make a tzurat petach? Okay? Or what if we said it's too wide, let's make a cross beam over the top that's very fancy. So even though it's too wide, we'll notice it. So the Gemara says, Tashma, come and listen. It says that if the mavoi is taller than 20 amot, you can lower it. And if it has the form of a doorway, you don't have to lower it. So what does that mean? That means that a tzurat petach works for both things. It works if the mavoi is too high, and it works if the mavoi is too wide. So it doesn't matter. Since you have the frame of a door, so whether it's too high or it's too wide, you fix the problem. However, the question is, amaltera beruch bomai, what about an amaltera if you have this fancy designed cross beam across the top, and it's too wide? Is it going to help you? We know that it helps you if it's too tall. Is it going to help you if it's too wide? So Tashma, come and listen to Tanya Mavoi Shu Gavoa Me'esrim Ama Yima'et V'Harachav Me'esrar Yima'et. We said that if the Mavoi is taller than 20 amot, you have to lower it. If it's wider than 10 amot, you have to lower it. In other words, you have to make it thinner. So V'im Yesh Lo Tzurat Petach Eno Tzarich Lema'et. But if it has the form of a doorway, you don't have to minimize it. So V'im Yesh Lo Amaltera Eno Tzarich Lema'et. And if it has an amaltera, if it has an artistically designed crossbeam going over the top, you don't have to make it any smaller. So what does that mean? It implies that both strategies work for both problems, because it mentions both problems. It mentions the problem of it being too tall, and it mentions the problem of it being too wide. And then it mentions the solution of having the form of a doorway, tzurat petach, and it also mentions the solution of having an artistic crossbeam over the top. So apparently both solutions work for both problems, because it lists the two problems and then it lists both solutions, and it doesn't say that one solution is restricted to one particular problem. So a
different sugya than yesterday, right? We're not within the same context of
No, it's a totally new.
Okay.
Yeah. So my lav asefa, doesn't that mean that the amaltera that is mentioned, this specially designed, artistically designed crossbeam, works not only to fix the problem of a mavoi that's too tall, but also asefa, the second case that's mentioned, which is the mavoi that's too wide, doesn't it also fix the mavoi that's too wide? So lo aresha, we could say that it's only referring back. In other words, it lists the two problems, A, B, and then it lists the two solutions. Okay, and when it lists the solutions, apparently, it lists them B, A. Okay, because it lists too tall, too wide. And then it lists Tzurat HaPetach, which fixes both problems. Okay, and then it mentions Amal Terah, the beautifully designed crossbeam, which really only fixes the first problem of the two. It doesn't fix the problem of it being too wide. Matznei le Rav Yehuda l'Chiyah bar Rav kamei de Rav. Once Rav Yehuda was teaching the Chiyah, the son of Rav, in front of Rav. You never want to teach the student. You don't want to teach the son of Rav right in front of Rav, because Rav is going to, say, hey, you don't know what you're doing. But he did it anyway. And it's exactly what happened. So he taught him, Eino tzarich lema'et, that if you have a tzurat hapetach, if you have the form of a doorway, then it doesn't matter that the space is too wide or that the mavoy is too tall. The tzurat hapetach will fix it. Now we learned earlier, and I think it was Daf Gimel, we learned that Rav doesn't agree with this idea. He says that a Tzurat HaPetach cannot fix the problem, because we learn the dimensions of a Mavoy from the dimensions of the Hechal in the Beit HaMikdash. And the Hechal was 10 amot wide and 20 amot tall, and that was the maximum. Even though it had a Tzurat HaPetach, even though it had the form of a doorway, that was the maximum. That's Rav's position. So when you heard him tell him that you don't have to make it any smaller if you use a Tzurat HaPetach, Amar le atnaye, teach him tzarich lema'et. You're teaching him the wrong thing. You should teach him that even though you have a Tzurat HaPetach, you still have to make it smaller.
Well, in that solution,
there's no solution according to Rav.
No, but if it was a solution, it leaves open a limit. In other words, does that mean that there is no limit? Like if you have a decoration, that means you can go 600 amot.
It's true. It doesn't specify. So earlier we said that even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who's more liberal, he only lets you go up to like 40 or 50 amot. He doesn't let you go up that high.
40,
yeah, right. You're right. It seems like it makes sense that there would be some kind of reasonable limit. I mean, if you have the Migdal Bavel over your head, you can't see the top no matter what.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. So it's not clear. It definitely doesn't make that clear.
Yeah.
So let's leave it as a question that we can research and look into, because it certainly doesn't make it clear what the limit is of the height. But it would seem reasonable to assume that there is some limit. Amar Rav Yosef says, "Midivrei Rabbeinu nilmad." We can learn from the words of Rabbeinu, meaning from Rav. Rav is the one that says that a Tzurat HaPetach is not going to help you. So we don't hold this way, obviously, because the Mishnah that we have and everybody else says that, if you have a Tzurat HaPetach, it's fine. It doesn't matter what the dimensions are. But according to Rav, he was a dat yachid, we would say. He was a one opinion, but very strong, very opinionated about it, that it has to be this way, that there's a maximum measurement, and you can't fix it. There's no getting around it. You can't put a Tzurat HaPetach. It's not going to help you. So Rav Yosef says, from this we can learn another thing, that chatzer sheruba pitachim v'chalonot inan niter b'tzurat HaPetach. That similarly, if you have a chatzer, the rule is that if you have a courtyards are enclosed. Now, the courtyard has to be what's called omed mirubeh ala parutz, which means that there has to be more enclosed space than open space. Remember yesterday we learned about this idea, that if the majority of the space is open, it's not considered enclosed. Even if you have lots of sticks around the perimeter, it's not considered enclosed unless the majority of the perimeter is enclosed and a minority is revealed. So from this principle of Rav, we can learn that a chatzer, a courtyard that has lots of chalonot, lots of windows and lots of doorways in it, cannot be fixed by having tzurot hapetach. That even if we made forms of a door in all of these openings and windows, which they normally do have, they're shaped in a door-like way, so we could say that doesn't help us, because we still have, if you were to look at the amount of space versus the amount of solid, you're going to have more space. Even though the space is in the form of many doorways, it's still going to be a problem. And what's the reasoning? So, my ta'ama, ho'il v'yoter me'eser oser b'mavoy u'parutz mirubeh al'omed oser b'chatzer. Because what's the issue in the mavoy? It's how wide it is. More than 10 amot wide is no good. Similarly, in a chatzer, what's the deal breaker? If you have parutz mirubeh al-ha'omed, if you have more open space than solid space, right? Then solid area. So ma yoter me'eser ha'oser b'mavoy eno nitar b'tzurat hapetach. Just like when it comes to the mavoy, what is Rav saying? He's saying that you can't fix the mavoi. If it's no good, if it's too wide, you can't fix it by putting tzurat petach. Af parutz mirubel ha'omed. Similarly, if you have an invalidity in the enclosure of the chatzer, of the courtyard, you're going to have the same problem that eno nitar b'tzurat petach. Right, that it should not be able to be fixed by putting a tzurat petach. In other words, if Rav is saying that if you have too much space, whether it be a mavoi that's too wide, or it be a chatzer that has too many holes in it, basically, that a tzurat petach does not solve the problem. It's not a remedy. So you should say in both cases it's not a remedy. So the Gemara says, no, we're going to question that analogy. We're going to say, Mali yoter me eser ha'oser ba'mavoi sheken lo itarta bo etzel pasei beraot l'Rebbi Meir. Tomar ba'parutz mirubel ha'omed ha'oser ba'chatzer sheken itarta etzel pasei beraot l'divrei hakol. I'll tell you, there's a difference between the concept of a wide mavoi and the concept of space that is greater than the enclosed area. Right? When you have a wall and there's more space than there is solid. Why is there a difference? Because when it comes to a mavoi, we find that wider than eser amot. What's the most lenient case of making a partition that we found yesterday, we discussed yesterday? The most lenient case is the pasei beraot, right? That they were able to make 4 corner pieces around an area in a perimeter. And within there was the well that they could draw from. And all you had was corner pieces of an amah facing this way and an amah facing this way. So basically what did you have? On either end of each side, to the north you had an amah and an amah. To the west you had an amah and amah. On this side you had an amah and amah, and on this side you had an amah and amah. So what does it turn out to be? And in between them, according to Rebbe Meir, not according to Rebbe Yehuda said you could have 13 and a third, right? Amot in between. But according to Rebbe Meir, even the most stringent opinion, or the opinion which is the definitive one, you can only have 10 amot in between them. Only 10 amot of space. So there, even though it's a very lenient situation, what do we allow you to have? Only 10 amot of space. Even though you have more open space than you have wall, for sure, right? Because you have 10 amot of space, 1 amah and 1 amah, you only have 2 amot that are closed on all 4 sides. So how much do you have?
It's like it's an exception.
Right, it's an exception. But the point, right. But over there, what do you see? You see that on one hand, what were they lenient about? They were lenient about parutz mirubel ha'omed. They didn't mind that there was more open space than there was enclosure. There's more space than there is wall. They didn't mind. But they did mind that it couldn't be more than 10 amot apart. So the same thing in a mavoi. Rav could tell you, I'm very stringent. If it's more than 10 amot wide, it's no good. But you'll say, well, what about a case where there's a wall with a lot of windows in it? That's a different story. Having more solid than space in a wall is a different issue. We could be more lenient about that issue. We could say tzurat petach will solve that issue. But the issue of how wide something is, we see that there, even in the most lenient of cases, they were still conservative about the amount of space between the 2 pillars in that case, or the 2 planks in that case. So therefore, it's not a perfect analogy. However, the Gemara says, Lema misayele, we can actually bring a proof to this position. Even though you showed that the analogy is not perfect, maybe we can actually show that a tzurat petach, a doorway, will not fix a wall that has too many holes in it. A Swiss cheese wall, okay, it has more holes than it has solid. It's not. Then maybe we can bring a proof, because it says defanot halalu sheruban pitachim v'chalonot. These types of walls that have the majority of them is windows and doors. So what do? Mutar, you can still carry within them. In other words, if these make an enclosure, you could still carry within them as long as you have that there's more solid than space. So the Gemara asks, wait a second, what do you mean here? That doesn't make any sense. Because sheruban salkadatach, you just told me that if the majority of it is windows and doors, and then you said as long as the majority is solid, it's okay. How could the majority be doorways and windows and the majority be solid at the same time? That is not consistent. What it means is it was speaking figuratively, meaning there's a lot. Like if I were to come to you and say, it was all windows and doors. I don't really mean that it's all windows and doors. I mean, there were a lot of windows and doors. Right? So if you have these walls that have a lot of windows and doors, as long as the majority is solid, Okay, ubilvad sheheh omed mirubei al parut. The rule is that it has to be that the majority is solid. So even in a case where you have windows and doorways making up the space, so it's not just space. It's not just like a broken wall. It's actually, because if it were a broken wall, then we'd have a different issue. And it's actually made in the shape of doorways. And even though it's made in the shape of doorways and it's made in the shape of chalonot, it's made in the shape of windows, we still say that it has to be majority solid and minority open. So that kind of proves the principle that they were suggesting. Because what was being suggested was that maybe Rav would say that even in a case of a wall that has many windows and many doorways, you're still going to require, you're not going to bend the rules because it's in the shape of a doorway. You're still going to say that we require the majority to be solid. Just like in the case of a mavoy, we're not going to bend the rules when it's more than 10 amot wide and say because you have the shape of a doorway, we're going to be lenient. We don't buy that. Okay, and you see that here, that even though there are doorways here and windows here, it's not just broken space, it's space shaped as doorways, and still we're not going to be lenient. So the Gemara says, wait, Amar Rav Kahana, you know what, I'm going to save the day here. I'm going to prove that really Tzurat HaPetach does help. It does help, even when you have too much open space. However, Kitanyahi bebetchei shima'eh. It's talking about spoiled or ruined doorways, not good doorways. In other words, this wall doesn't have normal doorway shapes in it, or normal window shapes in it. It has messed up ones. So now the question is, what does it mean by messed up? What do you mean by ruined doorways? Peligeba, Rav Rechomi, Rav Yosef. Rav Rechomi and Rav Yosef argue about it. Chad amar delet loho shikafe, v'chad amar delet loho tikra. So there are two possibilities. Either it means that the side posts are not straight, they're jagged. Okay, they're not straight vertical side posts. Or it means that it doesn't have a top bar going over. And then we have a picture of this in the back, illustrating what this would mean, the jagged sides or the not having a top piece. You have it there? Oh, you have an art scroll version? I'm looking in the Ma'or version in the back of my Gemara. Oh, you have numbers? Nice. Oh. Yeah, I do. I never noticed it before. Yeah. Right. So see the jagged. See the, yeah, then he mentions the numbers. Yeah. Jagged, and this is without a top. So either one of these, it's not a complete doorway. That's what we're talking about. So there, when you have the incomplete doorway, either because it has jagged sides, yeah, that's another thing. Either because it has jagged sides, or because it doesn't have a top. So in those cases, what do we say? We say that it doesn't really have a tzurat petach. It doesn't really have the form of doorways. It's lacking. That's why we require the majority of the wall to still be solid. But maybe if it did have the form of doorways, and it was complete doorways, with two straight vertical poles and a straight piece going on the top, then we would say that even though the majority is not solid, the majority is space, we still might be lenient in that case, despite what Rav says about the mavoy. In this case, we might be lenient. So we cannot actually prove it. Now, I wouldn't call that a proof the other way. It's just saying that we can explain this Braita in a way that doesn't come to a conclusion on that issue. Okay, so now, Va'af Rabbi Yochanan Tzavar Lahad Rav. And actually, Rabbi Yochanan agrees with this principle of Rav. The Amar Ravin Barav Ada Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Because Ravin Barav Ada said, that Rabbi Yitzchak said, Ma'aseh ba'adam echad mibikat Bet Chortan. That once there was a situation with somebody from the valley of Bet Chortan, Shena'atz Arba kondesin be'arba pinot hasadeh umatach zemora alehem. That what he did was he wanted to border his field. Now the problem is like this: if you want to sow diverse seeds in the same area of the ground, now you cannot obviously sow diverse seeds in the same place. What can you do? You have to make either a space between them, or you make a fence around one area where you are, let's say, planting your vineyard. And even right outside the fence, you can plant other seeds because it's clear that they're not part of the same field. Now, because you made a fence. Now, what he did was he put 4 posts, one to the, one in each corner. He had a square field, so he put 1 post in each corner, and then he stretched out a vine from post to post. So basically, he made a tzurot petach, right? A tzurat, the form of a door, on all 4 sides, and that was his fence. And he said, now I fenced in my vineyard, now I can, right next to it, I can plant whatever I want. I fenced in my vineyard with 4 doorways. Now let's assume right now, it's not that big. Size we don't know. So let's assume it's within the measurement. And it's going to talk about that later, but let's assume it's not an issue, and that we're talking about a situation where it's just 4 doorways, that's it. Now, what happened? So they came before the rabbis, and the rabbis said, you know what, that's good enough for kilayim. For mixing seeds, in other words, for diverse seeds, that's enough of a demarcation of the field. It's no problem at all. And Reish Lakish says, that Reish Lakish says that just like that is considered an enclosure with respect to kilayim, diverse seeds, it's also an enclosure for Shabbat. What does that mean? That means that even though what? You don't have a majority solid, you don't have any solid, still it's considered
to be a courtyard.
Right, it's considered like a courtyard. It's considered like an enclosure. Even though you have no solid, you just have doorways. 4 doorways is good enough according to Reish Lakish, even for Shabbat. But Rabbi Yochanan says that for kilayim, for the mixed seeds, it's good. But for Shabbat, Rabbi Yochanan says it's no good. So this is the Gemara is saying that Rabbi Yochanan is agreeing with Rav, because Rabbi Yochanan is saying that having tzurot petach, having doorways, doesn't remove the obligation that you still need a majority of the wall to be solid. If the majority of the wall is not solid for Shabbat purposes, then we don't recognize it as an enclosure, even though it's comprised of tzurot petach, even though it's comprised of doorways. And that's exactly what we were saying Rav would say, that we don't suspend the rule that you need a majority solid in the walls when you have doorways. Okay, that's what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. So now the Gemara says, "B'mai askinan." What are we talking about here? Ilema minatzad. If we're talking about minatzad, we'll see what that means in a second. So what it means is that when you make a tzurat petach, the top bar, the horizontal bar, has to be on top of the vertical bars. It can't be alongside them. In other words, if you were to imagine the 2 poles, well, I'll show you the picture in here. We don't even need to imagine it. We don't have to use your imagination. But the point is, if you have the 2 vertical poles, and running alongside them is the top pole, but it doesn't go over the top of those poles. That's why when we make a tzurat petach, if you have to make an eruv, what we do is we put poles in, and we put a nail on top of the pole, and we tie the string on top of on the nail, not on the pole itself. So if you put, let's say, 2 boards, and you want to enclose your backyard, let's say, to be able to carry, so you can make a tzurat petach. Let's say one of the sides is open. You make a tzurat petach, one board, and then you put a nail on the board and a nail on the other board, and you tie from nail to nail. If you tie from board to board, it's minatzad. Yeah, is that the one? Well, let me see. I can't tell. I have to look at the in here. It's number 87. 87 is where, if you look, he used a vine, and he tied the vine part way down. He didn't tie it on top. It's not on top of the pole, but it's midway down the pole. He tied it from pole to pole in the middle. 87. Right. That's what he's saying. So that's not good, Ben Saito. It's not good. So we said it's nothing. It has to be on top of them. It has to be 2 vertical poles and a horizontal pole that lays atop the horizontal. Right? It cannot be tied to their sides. Okay, leaving some of so that they protrude. Okay. Okay, Ella al gaban, it has to be on top of it then. Uvemai. So what's our case? Ilema ba'eser. If we're talking about that there was a space of 10 amot between each of the poles that this man set up, if that's the case, so beha lema Rabbi Yochanan b'Shabbat lo. If it's only 10 amot between them, why would Rabbi Yochanan say that it's not good? Why would Rabbi Yochanan say that that's not good if it's within 10? Okay, so it says Ela lav beyeter me'eser. Rather, we are talking about where it's more than 10 amot in space. In other words, it's more than 10 amot in space, and it must be that it was a proper tzurat petach, but it was trying to cover an area wider than 10 amot, and we know that Rav says that an area wider than 10 amot is no good. You can't fix it with a tzurat petach. If it's wider than 10 amot, it's definitely a breach. It's not going to be considered enclosed.
What do you mean 10 amot in space?
In what? Width. Between those two poles is more than 10 amot.
Right, so the width is more.
The width on each side is more than 10 amot. If that's the case, then it wouldn't. that's what it's suggesting. Elav beyeter me'eser. So it must be that we're talking about that it's wider than 10 amot. But the Gemara says, no, lo, le'olam be'eser. No, we're not talking about that. In other words, one possibility is, first the Gemara wanted to suggest that we're talking about a case where the space between each of the poles, that the Tzurat HaPetach was shaped fine, but the problem was there's more space between the poles than is allowed according to Rav. Because Rav said that you can't fix an opening of more than 10 amot using a Tzurat HaPetach. So we're not really talking about necessarily here the issue of enclosure and having more solid space than open space. We're just talking about closing this opening. Can this opening be closed if it's more than 10 amot? And Rav would say that no, a Tzurat HaPetach is not going to help you if the width of that opening is more than 10 amot. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan was saying. He's agreeing with Rav. But then the Gemara says, no, we can't assume that. What is the issue here? The issue here is that very question that we raised before. We're not talking about where the width between, the space between the poles is greater than 10. We're saying, well, let's just assume it's 10 or less. But the only question is, this was a Tzurat HaPetach where the top bar was too low. The top bar was on the side of the vertical bars. Instead of being on top of them, it was tied to their side. So let's say, for example, you had pole number 1 is 10 feet tall, and pole number 2 is 10 feet tall, and you tied it at the 9-foot mark. You tied the rope. You tied the rope to the pole itself. Okay, and then you tied the rope to the other pole. So where's the pole resting? Let's say it's resting a foot lower than the top of that pole. It's resting a foot lower than the top of the other pole, because right, like in the picture of the vine. So what happens? That the vertical poles are protruding beyond your top, so to speak. Your top is lower than the side posts. That's no good, according to Rav Chisda, but that's what they're arguing about. The Rabbi Yochanan says that's no good for Shabbat. It's okay for Kilayim, but it's no good for Shabbat. And according to Rish Lakish, it's good for Shabbat. That's what the argument is the Gemara is suggesting. But we're not getting into the issue of whether a Tzurat HaPetach can fix an area that's greater than 10 amot in width, because we're not even talking about a Tzurat HaPetach that's good. So now, the Gemara says, but Varami, Rabbi Yochanan, we can show a contradiction between two statements of Rabbi Yochanan. Varami, the Reish Lakish, and there's a contradiction between two statements of Reish Lakish as well. Tamar Reish Lakish, Mishum Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Hanina. The Reish Lakish said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Hanina, Pe'ah muteret enyan kilayim. This is again talking about tying. Pe'ah here means tying a vine from post to post. Okay, you're allowed to do that linyan kilayim avalo l'Shabbat, but you cannot do this for Shabbat. So wait a second. In the case just before, he said that tying the vine from post to post to make an enclosure was good for Shabbat and for mixed seeds. Now he's saying it's not good for Shabbat. V'Rabbi Yochanan amarkim chitzot l'Shabbat delo kach mechitzot l'kilayim delo. And Rabbi Yochanan is saying, just like it's no good for Kilayim, it's no good for Shabbat. So wait a second, before everyone agreed it was good for mixed seeds and the only argument was about Shabbat. Now everybody agrees it's no good for Shabbat and they're arguing about whether it's even good for Kilayim. They're both contradicting themselves. Because Reish Lakish said before that it was good for both, now he's saying it's only good for Kilayim. Rabbi Yochanan was at least agreeing it was good for Kilayim before. Now he's telling us it's not good for anything. So what's going on? So now, Bishlama the Reish Lakish, the Reish Lakish lo kasha. We can solve the Reish Lakish problem. Why? Because because this second statement is said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Hanina. Right? That's what it said. It said Reish Lakish says in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Hanina. So in the first case, he was saying his own opinion, which is that it's good for Kilayim and it's good for Shabbat. Then he reported his teacher's opinion that said it's only good for Kilayim, not for Shabbat. However, the Rabbi Yochanan kasha. But there's no simple solution to the contradiction between Rabbi Yochanan. How can he in the first case say it was good that you can make this doorway type enclosure for the sake of partitioning off one field from another, but you can't make it for Shabbat? And now he's saying you can't even make it to partition one field from another. So how do we solve it? Now, we could try to say that they're talking about two different cases. That in the first case, In the first case, it was talking about a situation where the tzurat petach was made properly, where the horizontal bar on the top was resting on top of the two vertical bars, and therefore it was perfectly fine. And in our case, and so therefore, for kilayim, everybody agreed that was good, and for Shabbat, they had an argument. And here, where they have the more stringent positions, that Rish Lakish is saying that it's not good for Shabbat, and Rabbi Yochanan is saying it's not good at all, is what we're talking about when it's affixed to the sides of the vertical posts. It's not resting on top of them, but it's resting too low. The top bar is resting too low. Okay, then we have no problem. We could say that that's why Rabbi Yochanan has different opinions. He was when it rested on the top, he was okay with it for kilayim, but not for Shabbat. When it rests on the side, he's not even okay with it for kilayim. However, but if you're going to tell me that in both cases we're talking about where the top bar is not resting on top of the vertical, it's resting on the sides. So how are we going to make a distinction here? Why does Rabbi Yochanan more permissive and Reish Lakish more permissive in case 1 and they're more stringent in case 2? Really, we're going to say that they're both talking about when it's affixed to the side. We're not talking about a good tzurat petach. And the difference is that over there was a space of 10 amot or less between the poles. So what did Rabbi Yochanan say? He said, listen, really I don't like this whole idea of having a tzurat petach that's incomplete, because the top bar is not actually on top of the vertical bars. The vertical bars are protruding past it. However, for kilayim I'll be lenient. And Reish Lakish said, you know what? I'm going to be lenient even for Shabbat. But in our case here, where they're being more stringent, we're talking about where the bars were separated by more than 10 amot in width. So therefore, you have two negatives. You have negative number 1, that the tzurat petach is not made properly. And you have problem number two, which is that the space between the vertical bars is too wide. So Rabbi Yochanan is going to say no.
Comparison, I have a little bit of a problem with comparison. Maybe I'm not understanding, because kilayim, my understanding of kilayim is that the reason for the separation is that physically you don't want to get them too close, so that there's a risk of the two seeds to intermingle. Whereas Shabbat is just something so that people are able to see. So one is a physical. It's a physical.
It's not really physical in kilayim, because basically, like in Masekhet Shabbat, it said in Masekhet Shabbat, in the 9th parak of Masekhet Shabbat, it mentions that if you have like a field of 6 by, you can have a field that's a small field, and you can actually put in it 5 different seeds, as long as you position them and organize them in a way that it's clear that they're distinct from one another. So it's more distinction than cross mingling. Okay. So here,
I think the concern was the roots.
Well, that's according to some. That's the reason. But as long as on the surface it's discernible, we're not worried about what goes on underneath, because really you don't really know, because the roots can spread very far. Okay. So then
from that perspective that we're making.
Right. So even offense. Right. So now we have what we call tartele reuta. 2 negatives. Number 1, the top beam is too low. Number 2, the spacing is too wide. So Reish Lakish steps his position down 1 and says, okay, now I'm only going to be lenient for mixed seeds. I'm not going to be lenient for Shabbat. And Rabbi Yochanan steps down his position 1 and says, now not only am I not going to allow it for Shabbat, I'm not going to allow it for kilayim either. So uminatim radishanelan ben eser lioter me'eser. And where do I get the idea that there's a difference between whether you have a space of 10 or more than 10? Da'amar le Rabbi Yochanan le Reish Lakish, because Rabbi Yochanan said to Reish Lakish, lo kacha yah ha'aseh. Wasn't there an event, a situation, shalach Rabbi Yoshua etz Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, that Rabbi Yoshua the Tana went to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri lilmod Torah, afal pi shebaki be'ilchot kilayim. Even though he was already an expert in the laws of mixed seeds, he went to learn with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri anyway. Umitza'or sheyoshev ben ha'ilanot. And he saw that he was sitting amongst trees, and he took a vine from one tree to the other, and he tied it in a sort of a tzurat petach there. And he said to him, V'amar lo Rabbi, and he said, my teacher, if you were to make an enclosure like that, all around on 4 sides, and then you were to sow seeds of you were to sow a vineyard in here, could I sow some other seeds right here? Meaning right out, would it be a good enclosure if you were to use that? And he said to him, Amar lo be'eser mutar be'yoter me'eser asur. He said, if the space between the 2 sides is 10 or up to 10, yes. If it's more than 10, no. B'mayaskina, what are we talking about here? Ilema al gaban yoter me'eser asur v'hatanya hayusham kanina dokranin v'asa lehen pe'a milmala afilu b'yoter me'eser mutar. It's not true that if it was a good tzurat petach, in other words, if it was a tzurat petach where the top bar was actually on top and it was above the vertical bars, the horizontal is above the vertical, then it would be good even with more than 10, because we learned that if you have kanina dokarnin, that if you had these sticks that were firmly planted in the ground, and you made an enclosure out of them. Even if it's more than 10, it's still good. Elalav min atzad. We're talking about a case where the top bar is too low. V'ka'amar le be'eser mutar, be'yoter me'eser asur. Shema mina. So what do you see from that? That what were they talking about? What was Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and talking about with Rabbi Yoshua? He was talking about a case, obviously, where the top part, the horizontal bar of the Tzurat HaPetach was too low, and that's why he was saying that there's a limit on whether it is more than 10 or less than 10. That's what Rabbi Yochanan says to Rish Lakish. But what do you see from the fact that Rabbi Yochanan says that to Rish Lakish? He's bringing a proof from that story that shows you that the context of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish's discussion was also a case where the top bar was too low, and therefore they were discussing a situation where there was more than 10 amot of space between the bars. And Rabbi Yochanan was saying that there everybody agrees that even for kilayim it's no good. And of course Rish Lakish was disputing this and saying that it's still good at least for kilayim, if not for Shabbat in that case. And that's basically the conclusion of this discussion. So we come up with a situation where in the first case, everybody seems to be agreeing now that except for Rav, perhaps, you can create a Tzurat HaPetach. If you have a space in an enclosed area that's more than 10 amot, you can create an enclosure, you can salvage that space by putting a Tzurat HaPetach. Even if it's more than 10 amot, you can fix it. However, as long as the Tzurat HaPetach is properly made, if you have an improperly made Tzurat HaPetach, this is where you start having a discussion. That if there's more than 10 amot in between the two poles, then according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's worthless. According to Rish Lakish, for kilayim, we could say it's okay. If you have less than 10 amot between the two poles, there, Rabbi Yochanan will allow it for kilayim. Rish Lakish will allow it even for Shabbat, if it's less than 10 amot between the two poles, in that case. So now we move on to the next discussion. Gufa, we go back to something we said before. Amar Rav Chisda Tzurat HaPetach shasa min hatzad lo asav lo klum. We said that if you make the Tzurat HaPetach on the side, meaning that the top bar is not actually going over the top, but it's running along the sides of the vertical, that it is nothing. Rav Chisda further said that when you make a Tzurat HaPetach, it has to be strong enough, sturdy enough of a tzura that you could hang a door on it. Even just a door of straw, meaning the lightest imaginable door would have to be able to be supported by it. It can't be flimsy, in other words, it has to be sturdy.
But the point is that it has to be a functional door.
It doesn't actually have to be a door there. It has to just be the shape of a door.
You would have to actually be able to hang a functional door.
A straw door, which means like a paper-thin door. It could be imaginary, practically, yeah. So, Amar Reish Lakish Mishum Rabbi Yanai. Reish Lakish said in the name of Rabbi Yanai, Tzurat HaPetach tzricha heker tzir. That according to Rabbi Yanai, you need to have a hinge on the bottom. So, my heker tzir, Amar Rav Avya avakta. Rav Avya says that it means that it has to have some kind of a hinge or a hole for a hinge on the bottom. So I believe that Rashi explains on the side that it means that there needs to be a hole there. It doesn't have to actually have a door, but there has to be a hole that you could put a hinge in if there were a door. So how it has to be, in other words, as realistic as possible. As realistic without a door as possible. So you have the shape of a door, you have to have a hinge, because if there were to be a door, you would need to put the door into this hinge that it would twist on in the ground. So it has to be very realistic. So there has to not only be the shape, but part of the form, according to Rabbi Yanai, is that you also have a hole in the ground that would be the hinge hole, if there were really a door. So it has to be almost like there's a virtual door, an imaginary door there. The shape is there, the sturdiness is there, the hole is in the ground. The only thing you don't have is the actual door. Everything else is there. So now, Ashkechinu Rav Achabarei de Rav Avya, Litalmidei de Rav Ashi. Rav Acha Berei the Rav Avia, the son of Rav Avia, found the students of Rav Ashi Amar Lahu. He said to them, Amar Mar Midi B'Tzurat HaPetach. They said, did your teacher say anything about the form of a door, about Tzurat HaPetach? Amruleh, they said to him, Lo Amar V'Lo Klum. He didn't say anything. He didn't talk about it. Tanat says in the Tosefta, Tzurat HaPetach Shamru Kana Mikan V'Kana Mikan V'Kana Al Gabehen Tzrichin Liga Oen Tzrichin Liga. So we know that the form of a Tzurat HaPetach is that you have two vertical bars and one horizontal bar on top. Do the vertical bars have to reach the horizontal bar? Is it enough that you have two vertical bars and a foot above them is a horizontal bar? Or do you need it?
You can actually have a door on one hinge on the floor and one hinge on the side, and you don't need a top. So
right.
You could actually have a door without having a top.
Well, the question is, if you have a top bar, let's say you had, and then let's say you just had a top.
Yeah.
Okay, and then you have, or let's say you just have something running across, whatever, and you want to make it Tzurat HaPetach. So you have something, just a board running across. Yeah. So you say, okay, there's a board running across. I'm going to make two vertical poles right here. Do the vertical poles actually have to reach that top bar to make it a form of a door? That's the question. Do they have to actually touch it?
Yeah.
Or not?
But if they're talking about making...
Or if it's wide open... No, they're not. They're just saying the form of a functional door. Just the form of it, yeah. So the question is, do these two posts that are here have to reach the top post? We know that the top post has to be above them. Does it have to be resting on them physically?
They have to.
Or can it be above? That's the question being asked. So now we have Rav Nachman Amar Ein Tzrichin Liga. Rav Nachman says, no, as long as you have two vertical and one horizontal, they don't have to touch. Rav Sheshet Amar Tzrichin Liga. Rav Sheshet says they do have to touch. Azal Rav Nachman va'avad uvda be'resh galuta kishma'ateh. Rav Nachman went in the house of the exilarch, followed his own opinion. In other words, he made a Tzurat HaPetach there where the two poles did not touch the crossbeam. They didn't touch it. In other words, let's say there was some overhang from whatever, right? And you just put two poles, but they don't reach the top. They're not tall enough to reach the top, but there is if you were to look, you'll see a horizontal piece, and below it, two vertical pieces, but they don't actually reach the top. Okay, so he says that's good, so we did it that way. Amar le Rav Sheshet l'shema'eh Rav Gada. Rav Sheshet said to his servant Rav Gada, Zil Shalof Shadinu, go take down that Tzurat HaPetach. It's not kosher. This is rabbinical politics of the old days. Azal Shalaf Shadinu. So he went and he took it down. But the problem was, the problem was that the members of the household of the exilarch see this guy vandalizing their place and they arrested him. They put him in jail. Not good. Azal Rav Sheshet kam abava. Rav Sheshet went and stood at the door of the jail. Amar le gada pokta nafak viata. So he went and said, come out. Pokta. Come out. And he came out. So Rav Sheshet went and he bailed him out of jail, basically. He said, thanks a lot for doing work. I didn't know you were going to get arrested for doing it. And come home.
Was the Reish Galuta?
No, he wasn't. Rav Sheshet was interfering. So Rav Nachman was the rabbi that was hired to do the job. He said this was kosher. The other, it's like when you have one supervising agency, saying something is kosher. The OU is supervising, and then the Star K comes in and they say, oh, no, this is not kosher. And they start dismantling everything. So Ashkechei Rav Sheshet the Rabba Bar Shmuel. Rav Sheshet found Rabbi Bar Shmuel. Amarle, he said, Tanei Mar Midi B'Tzurat HaPetach. Have you learned anything about any halachot about Tzurat HaPetach? Now remember, Rav Sheshet is the rabbi that's machmir. He says that the two vertical poles have to actually touch the horizontal. So Amarle said, yes, we learned something. Tanina kippah Rabbi Meir mechayev b'mezuzah v'chachamim potrein. So very interesting case. This case comes up in a couple of places in Shas, that if you have that you have a kippah is a round. It doesn't mean the kippah that we wear on your head. It means a rounded doorway. The rounded doorway has, instead of being a square doorway that has two distinct posts and a horizontal straight-lined crossbeam, what it has instead is a curved top. So the curved top is like this. So the question is it chayav?
Archway.
Yeah, an archway. It has an archway. It's curved. It has an archway. So the question is, now we're going to be talking about different aspects here. We're going to be talking about the height of the doorway. We're going to be talking about the place where it starts to curve. At what point does it start to curve? And we're going to be talking about ragleha, the legs of it. Legs of it are down here. Okay? Now there are three issues with the doorway. Number one is that the first three tifachim of the doorway must be 4 amot in width.
So the same thing as mezuzah, right?
Okay, it must be 4 amot in width. Okay, so and then you have that it has to be 10 tefachim tall. Okay, so we're going to see this in a second. Now, hold on. Now I got to go back to my page. Okay, so the question is this rounded? Is this archway obligated in? I'm sorry, I said mot. I meant to say tefachim before. The doorway has 4 tefachim, and the first 3 tefachim has to be 4 tefachim wide. I didn't mean to say 4 amot. That would be big. Then most doorways are not 4 amot wide. We wouldn't have any mezuzot if we had that. Yeah. Anyway, so the question is: does an archway require mezuzah? So Rabbi Meir says yes, and the rabbis say no. Now, why does Rabbi Meir say yes? Because he basically says a concept of chokekin lahashlim, which means that even though it doesn't have the proper dimensions, because proper dimensions would be you have 4 tefachim of space at least, going up to a height of 10 tefachim, and then a crossbeam that goes straight across the 4 tefachim. That's the simplest case. Here, what do you have? You have at the bottom 4 tefachim maybe, but at some point it starts to round out. So you don't actually have the measurements, the dimensions of a doorway for mezuzah. So now that's the problem. Now, what is the vishavin? They agree in a case she'im yesh beraglea asara shehi chayevet, that if before it starts to curve, it has 10 tefachim. In other words, 10 tefachim goes straight up. And then it curves with a curvature on the top. There's an arch on the top. That's not going to ruin it. Only if it curves before the 10 tefachim is there an issue. If it starts to curve before the 10 tefachim, that's going to be a problem. So Amar Abaye Abaye says Hakol modim im gavoa asara vein beraglei shlosha inam yesh beraglei shlosha vein gavoa asara, that if everybody also agrees as follows, that if it's 10 tefachim tall, but the first 3 tefachim it doesn't have 3 tefachim with 4 tefachim of width. In other words, like we said, it can start to get narrow as it goes up, but those first 3 tefachim from the ground must be 4 tefachim wide of space. Then it can start to thin out as it goes up. But it has to have that, and it has to have 10 tefachim of height. Okay? In total. However, so he says, even if it has that the first 3 tefachim of height are 4 tefachim wide, but it doesn't have a total height of 10 tefachim, it's also v'lo klum, it's nothing. When are they arguing? When the first 3 tefachim have 4 tefachim of width. In other words, the first 3 tefachim off the ground have a width of 4 tefachim. And it goes to a height of 10 tefachim, even if it's thinned out, it's narrowed out along the way. But the only thing is, but when you get to the top, it's no longer 4 tefachim in width anymore. But you could cut it out to complete 4 amot. So I'm sorry, 4 tefachim. So now, I'll explain what the relevance of this is to our case in a second. But I'm going to tell you. So what do we see? What is the situation here? So it's easiest to see in the illustration. It's harder to speak it, to describe it verbally. So what you end up having is like this: that in a case like this, everybody is going to agree that you would have a mezuzah. Why? Because you have 10 tefachim of height, then it curves around. This 10 tefachim, and it's wide, it's 4 tefachim wide. The whole way up, it's for sure. And then it curves on the top, so big that we don't care. Here you have that it's too narrow, it becomes narrow too soon. If it gets narrowed within 3 tefachim, it's already less than 4 tefachim in width before it reaches 3 tefachim in height, so that's already too narrow, so that's no good. Over here, it's wide enough the whole way, but it doesn't reach 10 tefachim in height. So that's no good. Here's the case where they argue, where you have, it's 4 tefachim wide at the bottom, and then it starts to get narrow after the 3 tefachim, which is fine. It goes to a height of 10 tefachim. But the last, let's say 7 tefachim, are less than 4 tefachim in width. So according to the Chachamim, it has to be 4 tefachim in width all the way up to 10 tefachim in height, and then it can have an archway. According to Rabbi Meir, no. Even if it starts to narrow after 3 tefachim, and it's less than 4 tefachim in width going all the way up to the top, as long as it reaches 10, that's okay. Why? Because chokekin hashlim, which means we imagine that we can cut out from the wall a square door that would be 4 tefachim in width.
But you could do that in the other case too. You could do that in the
But it doesn't. It has to reach certain dimensions first. In other words, the space has to reach at least. If the space, in other words, basically it's like this: that if all of the different points that we have to hit are hit according to Rabbi Meir. In other words, you have 3 tefachim at the bottom that are wide enough. You have a height of 10 tefachim.
Yeah.
So then we can say the rest of it. I will just imagine that it all.
That it only leaves a little bit to the imagination.
Right.
Whereas
the other ones are missing something fundamental. It's not actually 10 tefachim in height anywhere. The space is nowhere 10 tefachim in height, or it's nowhere wide enough. Right. Even within 3 tefachim, it's not wide enough. So in those cases, it's fundamentally flawed. But in this case, it's just a matter of degree. Rabbi Meir says we'll just cut out an imaginary space to fill in what we're missing at the top of the doorway. The rabbi said you can't do that. It has to be that 10 full tefachim in height are 4 tefachim in width.
Right.
Whereas Rabbi Meir is saying as long as the first 3 are 4 tefachim in width, even if it starts to narrow out, as long as it reaches 10 tefachim in height, we can just imagine that it's 4 tefachim in width the whole way up. Okay, now, but what do you see? Why is this relevant to our case? Because where is the top of this tzurat petach going to be according to Rabbi Meir? Where's the top of it going to be? It's going to be here.
like above.
It's going to be above where the arms are, where the vertical poles are.
Right.
The vertical poles are going to be distant from where we're imagining the top to be. Or over here. The vertical case, in other words, over here, we're also using the same principle as Rabbi Meir, that we're imagining as if chokekin, as if we're cutting the top bar of this tzurat petach, because even in the case where the rabbis agree, because there's a full 10 tefachim of doorway, which is 4 tefachim wide, and then it starts to become an archway and to thin out. So what are we considering in this tzurat petach? What are we considering to really be the top bar? We're considering it to be up here, an imaginary top bar that's not actually touching the vertical bars, because we're only counting these vertical bars down here. Right? We're only counting the vertical bars up to 10 tefachim according to the rabbis.
So the relevance is they're trying to prove that it does not.
So you see that the vertical bar doesn't need to touch.
The vertical.
Because you see that if it did need to touch, then according to Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim, in these cases where we're imagining the vertical bar, and it's really, the vertical bar is really distant from the horizontal bar is really distant from the 2 vertical bars.
Right.
Because even in the case where the rabbis agree, because it has the minimum measurement and only then starts to taper off into an arch, still what are they saying is the tzurat petach, is the part on top.
Right.
The part that's imaginary is the tzurat petach, and it's distant from the actual 2 legs, so to speak, of the doorway. And what do you see? Yet they still say it's okay. So they're saying to Rav Sheshet, you're wrong, man. You sent your servant in to dismantle this tzurat petach, and it was wrong. Because really, Rav Nachman was right. You don't need the 2 sidebars to touch the top bar. We see it from the case of mezuzah. So what did he say to them? This is really funny. He says to them, Amar lo, he said to them, if you happen to run into anybody from the exilarch's house, don't tell them about this. Because, velo midi, meha matnitzat de kippah. In other words, don't tell them, right? Lo tema lo leberesh galuta velo midi. Right, so don't tell them anything about this Mishnah that you just found about the archway and the mezuzah. Why? Because they're going to hear that I was such a kanai. I made such a big deal out of this tzurat petach, and I was really wrong. You have a proof that I was totally wrong, and I'm going to be really embarrassed now. They're going to be even angrier with me. They're already angry. They threw my servant in jail for dismantling it. Now they're going to be even angrier with me when they find out that it was all done under false pretenses, and I was unaware of this proof that you brought against me. And so we'll leave it there for today.